The fluorescent lights of Seoul General Hospital buzzed overhead like angry insects as Zara Williams pressed her back against the cold corridor wall, her nursing scrubs still damp with sweat from her 12-hour clinical rotation. At 2 in the morning, the hallways held that particular silence of institutions where sleep was a luxury few could afford. Her grandmother's condition had taken another turn for the worse, and the mounting medical bills felt like a crushing weight on her chest. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone to text her best friend Maya, desperate for someone to understand the impossible choice she was facing between continuing nursing school and finding a way to pay for the care her grandmother desperately needed. "I can't do this anymore," she typed rapidly into her phone. "Grandma's getting worse, and they want another $10,000 for the new treatment. I might have to drop out of nursing school to get a second job. But then what was all this for? I'm so scared, Maya. I don't know who else to talk to at this hour." She hit send without double-checking the contact, her exhaustion making her careless in a way that would change everything. 3 miles away in the glass-walled conference room on the 52nd floor of the Kong International Building, Minjun Kong sat at the head of an obsidian table that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. His charcoal Armani suit was still immaculate despite the late hour, every line of his tall frame radiating the controlled stillness of a predator temporarily at rest. The meeting with the Los Angeles Territory representatives had stretched into the night, each word measured, and weighted with consequences that could shift the balance of power across 2 continents. When his phone buzzed against the polished surface, he glanced at it with the same analytical precision he applied to everything in his world. The number was unfamiliar, which was impossible. Only 5 people had his direct line, and none of them would text him emotional confessions about family medical crises. He read the message twice, his dark eyes narrowing as he processed the raw vulnerability bleeding through the screen. In his world, emotion was weakness and weakness was death. Yet something about the genuine desperation in those words created an unexpected crack in his carefully constructed armor. The man across from him, a scarred veteran of the California operations, noticed his boss's unusual stillness. "Is there a problem, sir?" Minjun's gaze remained fixed on the phone. "Continue the briefing. I'll rejoin you in a moment." He stepped away from the table, his Italian leather shoes silent on the marble floor as he moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His reflection stared back at him, all sharp angles and controlled power, while he considered the impossible situation of a stranger accidentally revealing their most vulnerable moment to the most dangerous man in Seoul's underground. Back at the hospital, Zara stared at her phone screen with growing alarm. Maya always responded immediately to her crisis texts, usually with a stream of supportive emojis and offers to bring emergency chocolate. Instead, there was only silence stretching into uncomfortable minutes. She checked the contact name again, and her blood ran cold. The last digit was wrong. Instead of Maya's familiar number, she had somehow sent her most private breakdown to a complete stranger. Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed a frantic apology. "I am so sorry. Wrong number. Please delete that message. Ignore everything I just said." In his tower office, Minjun watched the follow-up message appear and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity, not the calculated interest he took in business opportunities or potential threats, but genuine human curiosity about the person behind the authentic pain he'd just witnessed. Instead of deleting the conversation as any reasonable person would do, he found himself studying the messages again. The grammar was educated, the concerns legitimate, the emotion unguarded in a way that suggested someone completely outside his world of calculated deceptions. He typed a careful response. "Your message is safe. I hope your grandmother recovers." When Zara saw the reply, her hands began to shake. She had expected anger, demands to know how she got this number, or simply no response at all. Instead, this stranger had offered the first kind words she'd heard all night. Before she could stop herself, she typed back, "Thank you. That means more than you know. I'm sorry for bothering you so late." Minjun stared at her response for a long moment before making a decision that would shatter every protocol he'd built his empire on. He walked back to the conference table where 6 of his most trusted lieutenants waited with the patience of men who understood the cost of rushing their leader. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this tomorrow night. Something urgent requires my attention." The room cleared with military efficiency, leaving him alone with the city lights and a phone number that belonged to someone who had accidentally shown him what genuine vulnerability looked like. As Zara finally headed home through the empty streets, wondering if she would ever be brave enough to face another day like this one, she had no idea that a man who controlled half the organized crime in Korea was already planning to find her. Not to harm her, but because her accidental message had reminded him of something he thought he'd lost forever: the ability to feel something real. The wrong number that should have been deleted would instead become the thread that pulled 2 worlds together, and neither of them would ever be the same. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever sent a text to the wrong person that completely changed your day? Sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most unexpected opportunities. Minjun Kong had built his power on the principle that information was everything and emotions were nothing. But as he sat alone in his office, still holding the phone that contained a stranger's honest tears, he began to understand that some rules were meant to be broken, and some wrong numbers were exactly right. The morning sun cast long shadows across Minjun's private office as he stared at the phone number displayed on his computer screen. He had spent the remaining hours before dawn doing something he hadn't done in years, thinking about someone else's problems instead of his own empire. The disciplined routine that governed every aspect of his life felt suddenly insufficient against the memory of genuine desperation in those midnight texts. He pressed the intercom button with a measured precision that marked all his movements. "Send Park up immediately." Park Hyunwoo appeared within minutes, his laptop already in hand and his expression carefully neutral. The head of digital intelligence for the Kong organization had learned long ago never to question his boss's requests, no matter how unusual they seemed. His thin frame and wire-rimmed glasses made him appear more like a university professor than one of Korea's most skilled cyber specialists, which was exactly the camouflage that made him invaluable. "I need you to trace this number," Minjun said, sliding a piece of paper across the mahogany desk. "Full background, employment history, financial status, family connections, any criminal associations." Park glanced at the number and nodded. "Time frame?" "By noon." The slight raising of Park's eyebrows was the only indication of surprise. Full backgrounds typically required 48 hours for thoroughness. "Is this related to the Los Angeles situation?" Minjun turned back to the window where the city sprawled below him like a circuit board of power and possibility. "Call it due diligence on a potential security concern." As Park left to begin his investigation, Minjun remained at the window, watching the morning traffic flow through streets his organization controlled with invisible precision. He told himself the background check was merely professional curiosity, a loose thread that needed to be tied off cleanly. But the careful lies he built his life on felt suddenly transparent against the memory of authentic emotion. Across the city, Zara sat in the hospital cafeteria nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like liquid exhaustion. Her grandmother's condition had stabilized during the night, but the relief was overshadowed by the stack of medical bills growing thicker by the hour. She calculated the numbers again on the back of a napkin, trying to find some combination of work hours and loan applications that might make the impossible possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the diner where she worked evenings. "Can you cover Linda's shift tonight? Double pay." She typed back immediately. "Yes." "What time?" The diner job was exactly the kind of work she'd promised herself she'd never have to do permanently. But nursing school had always been a long shot for a girl from her neighborhood, and keeping her grandmother alive was proving more expensive than her optimism had calculated. She gathered her things and headed for the exit, unaware that a black sedan had been parked across from the hospital entrance since dawn. By 11:30, Park had assembled a file that painted a remarkably clear picture of Zara Williams' life. 22 years old, pre-nursing student at Seoul National University. Partial scholarship recipient maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working 3 part-time jobs. No criminal history, no suspicious associations, no connections to any organization that might pose a threat. Her grandmother, Evelyn Williams, was a retired English teacher whose medical bills had consumed the family's modest savings. Most intriguingly, Zara had been accepted to nursing programs at 4 universities, but chose Seoul National specifically because it offered the best financial aid package. Her admission essay, which Park had somehow managed to access, spoke of wanting to help people who couldn't help themselves. The sincerity was so genuine it felt almost naive. Minjun studied the file with the same intensity he applied to analyzing rival territories. Everything about Zara Williams suggested exactly what her midnight text had revealed. An ordinary young woman facing extraordinary pressures with remarkable grace. No hidden agendas, no calculate d'angles, no deception layered beneath deception. In his world, such transparency was either masterful manipulation or dangerous innocence. He found himself studying her university identification photo longer than necessary. Her dark eyes held determination mixed with weariness, and her smile suggested someone who had learned to find joy despite circumstances that would crush weaker people. She was beautiful in a way that seemed entirely unconscious of its own power, which in his experience was either impossible or extraordinarily rare. That evening, Zara tied her apron around her waist in the narrow kitchen of Mickey's Diner, a 24-hour establishment that served coffee and comfort food to night shift workers and insomniacs. The familiar rhythm of taking orders and pouring coffee provided a temporary refuge from the weight of her real problems. She moved through her shift with practiced efficiency, her natural warmth drawing larger tips from customers who seemed to sense her genuine care. What she didn't notice was the man in the expensive suit who had been nursing a single cup of coffee in the corner booth for 3 hours, his dark eyes tracking her movements with predatory focus. Or the way conversations seemed to quiet when he looked up from his newspaper. Or how the diner's usual late-night troublemakers had mysteriously decided to find somewhere else to cause problems. Minjun watched her work and felt something shift inside his carefully controlled world. She moved with purpose and grace despite obvious exhaustion, treating every customer with the same respectful attention regardless of how much they ordered or how they were dressed. When an elderly man struggled with his bill, she quietly comped his coffee without making him feel like charity. When a drunk customer became aggressive, she defused the situation with firm kindness that somehow commanded respect without escalating tension. This was what authentic strength looked like. Not the calculated power he wielded through fear and control, but the natural authority of someone who genuinely cared about others. Watching her reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. That power could be used to protect instead of dominate. As closing time approached, Minjun made a decision that violated every security protocol he had spent 15 years perfecting. Instead of having Park continue surveillance from a distance, he would approach her directly. Not with the full weight of his organization behind him, but as simply as possible under the circumstances. He left a $100 tip on a $12 check and walked out into the night, already planning how to orchestrate a meeting that wouldn't terrify the woman whose accidental message had reminded him what it felt like to care about someone else's pain. Behind him, Zara found the money and stared at it in confusion. Mickey's Diner didn't typically attract customers who left tips larger than most people's daily wages. But her grandmother's medical bills didn't allow for pride, and she tucked the money into her apron with a whispered prayer of gratitude to whatever guardian angel was looking out for her tonight. If she had known that her guardian angel controlled half the criminal enterprises in Seoul and was currently planning to upend her entire world, she might have been considerably less grateful. But sometimes the most dangerous rescues come disguised as simple kindness. The apartment Minjun had arranged for her occupied the 38th floor of a glass tower that pierced Seoul's skyline like a crystal blade. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view that transformed the city into a glittering circuit board of light and shadow, beautiful and impersonal in the way that extreme wealth often was. The furnishings were elegant without being ostentatious, chosen by someone who understood the difference between luxury and display. Zara stood at the living room window, still wearing her diner uniform, trying to process the surreal shift from worrying about rent money to occupying space that probably cost more per month than most people earn in a year. Her single duffel bag sat on the Italian leather sofa, like a reminder of the world she had just left behind, though she suspected it was a world she could never completely return to. Her grandmother was indeed in a private suite at Seoul's most prestigious medical facility, being attended by specialists who had flown in from 3 different countries. The speed with which Minjun had arranged everything was both reassuring and terrifying, proof of the kind of power that could reshape reality with a few phone calls. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. She opened it to find a young woman in a crisp business suit holding a collection of shopping bags that probably represented more money than Zara had ever seen in one place. "Miss Williams," the woman said with a polite bow. "My name is Lee Sujin. Mr. Kong asked me to ensure you have everything you need. I brought clothes, toiletries, and some basic necessities." Zara accepted the bags with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. The kindness was genuine, but it emphasized how completely her independence had evaporated in the span of 24 hours. She was now a kept woman, regardless of how respectfully her keeper presented the arrangement. "Thank you," she said, setting the bags inside. "Is there anything else I need to know about living here?" "Mr. Park will drive you to school and work when needed," Sujin replied. "He's very discreet and has instructions to stay out of your way unless you require assistance. Mr. Kong will check in periodically to ensure your comfort." As Sujin departed, Zara realized that her new life came with an infrastructure of control disguised as convenience. She was protected, provided for, and monitored with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing valuable assets. The apartment might be beautiful, but it was still a gilded cage. That evening, as she attempted to study at the dining table that could have seated 12 people, Minjun arrived without warning. She heard the electronic lock disengage and looked up to see him standing in the doorway, still wearing his immaculate suit, but carrying a takeout bag for what appeared to be an expensive Korean restaurant. "I brought dinner," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I assumed you might not have had time to arrange food." The gesture was considerate, but his unannounced entry reminded her that this space belonged to him, not her. She was a temporary resident in his world, dependent on his generosity and subject to his access. "You don't knock," she observed, closing her textbook and meeting his gaze directly. Something flickered in his dark eyes, an expression that might have been surprise or approval. "It's my building," he replied, but his tone held a question rather than a statement. "And this is my home," she countered, her voice steady despite the way her pulse quickened when he was near. "Temporarily, maybe, but while I'm here, I'd appreciate the courtesy of being asked before being visited." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the elegant space, and Zara realized this was her first real test of whether his protection came with respect or merely possession. His stillness was absolute, the kind of control that suggested he was processing her challenge with the same analytical precision he applied to business decisions. "You're right," he said finally. "It won't happen again." The admission surprised her more than aggression would have. Men in her experience didn't typically yield ground when their authority was questioned, especially men who clearly expected immediate deference from everyone around them. "Why did it affect you?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could consider its wisdom. "My text message. Why did it matter enough to make you track me down?" Minjun set the takeout bag on the kitchen counter and turned back to her with an expression that was carefully controlled, yet somehow vulnerable. "Because in 15 years of managing people and situations and territories, no one has ever shown me anything as real as your fear for someone you love." The honesty in his voice was unexpected, a crack in the armor that revealed something recognizably human underneath the dangerous control. She found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine admission. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "You collecting authenticity like some people collect art?" He smiled then, a brief expression that transformed his features from intimidating to almost approachable. "No," he said. "This is me trying to figure out how to be near something real without destroying it. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Zara felt something shift in her perception of him. The danger was still there, probably always would be, but underneath, it was a man who seemed genuinely uncertain about how to navigate normal human connection. They ate dinner together at the oversized table, the conversation flowing more naturally than either of them had expected. She told him about nursing school, about her grandmother's stories of teaching English to 3 generations of soul children, about her plans to work in community health, where she could help people who might not otherwise receive good care. He listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to extracting information, but his questions suggested genuine interest rather than strategic analysis. In return, he shared carefully edited versions of his legitimate business interests: real estate development, import coordination, security consulting. Nothing that directly referenced the criminal enterprises that obviously funded his lifestyle, but enough to paint a picture of someone who understood power structures and resource management on a massive scale. The evening might have continued in this surprisingly comfortable vein if his phone hadn't buzzed with an incoming call that immediately changed his entire demeanor. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The man who had been asking thoughtful questions about her career goals disappeared, replaced by someone whose stillness radiated lethal competence. "I have to take this," he said, moving toward the windows where the city lights turned his reflection into a silhouette of controlled power. The conversation was brief and conducted in rapid Korean, but Zara didn't need translation to understand that something significant had shifted in his world. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "Is everything all right?" she asked, though his body language already provided the answer. "There's been a development in some business negotiations," he replied, the careful euphemism not quite concealing the tension in his voice. "Nothing that affects you directly, but I may need to be less available for the next few days." "What kind of development?" she pressed, her instincts picking up on the subtle signs of someone preparing for conflict. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing how much truth to reveal. "The kind that reminds people why cooperation is preferable to competition," he said finally. The clinical phrasing couldn't disguise what he was really saying. Someone was challenging him, and he was preparing to respond with the kind of force that would settle the matter permanently. The realization that she was now connected to a man who resolved conflicts through violence should have been more disturbing than it was. Instead, she found herself studying his face and recognizing something that looked almost like regret, as if he wished their developing connection didn't have to coexist with the darker aspects of his life. "Will you be safe?" she asked, the word escaping before she could consider their implications. His expression softened slightly at her concern. "Yes," he said, "but my enemies have a tendency to look for pressure points they can exploit. Your presence in my life makes you theoretically interesting to people who might want to send me a message." The understanding hit her like cold water. She wasn't just accepting his protection anymore. She was accepting the reality that her connection to him made her a target for anyone who wanted to hurt him. The comfortable evening they had shared was an illusion built on the foundation of very real danger. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Accepting my help?" She considered the question seriously, weighing her fear against her grandmother's peaceful face in the hospital bed that afternoon, attended by the kind of medical care that money could buy and love couldn't. "No," she said finally, "but I'm beginning to understand what the real cost might be." He nodded, approval, and something that looked like relief flickering across his features. "Understanding the cost is the first step in being prepared to pay it," he said, "and I give you my word that I will do everything in my power to minimize what you have to sacrifice." As he prepared to leave, Zara realized that their arrangement had evolved beyond simple protection. They were becoming partners in a dangerous game she was only beginning to understand. And despite all logic, she was discovering that she trusted him to keep his promises. The man who had found her through an accidental text message was proving to be exactly the kind of dangerous refuge she had never known she needed. 3 days after Minjun's ominous phone call, Zara was beginning to believe that maybe the business conflict would resolve itself through negotiations rather than violence. She had fallen into a routine that felt almost normal despite its underlying strangeness. Park drove her to morning lectures, waited discreetly during her clinical rotations at the hospital, then delivered her safely back to the glass tower that had become her temporary refuge. The pediatric ward where she was completing her nursing practicum felt like a return to her real world, where her value came from competence and caring rather than her connection to dangerous power. She moved through the morning medication rounds with quiet efficiency, her gentle manner with the young patients earning approval from supervising nurses who had initially been skeptical of her sudden arrival with suspicious funding backing. It was during lunch break, as she sat in the hospital cafeteria reviewing case notes, that everything went wrong with devastating speed. The man who approached her table looked entirely ordinary, middle-aged, wearing scrubs that suggested he belonged in the medical environment, carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone who had every right to be there. When he sat down across from her without invitation, her first instinct was annoyance rather than alarm. "Miss Williams," he said, his English accented but clear, "I need you to come with me quietly. Your cooperation will ensure this remains simple." The reasonable tone made the threat feel surreal, like dialogue from a television drama, rather than something happening in her ordinary life. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw the kind of coldness that transformed ordinary faces into something predatory. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse had begun to race. "I think you have the wrong person." "I think we both know I don't," he replied, reaching into his pocket to withdraw what looked like a medical syringe. "This contains something that will make you very cooperative for the next few hours. We can do this quietly, or we can make a scene that will endanger every child on this ward. Your choice." The threat to the children crystallized her terror into something more manageable. Fear for herself she could handle, but the possibility of innocent people being hurt because of her connection to Minjun transformed panic into calculated action. "What do you want?" she asked, buying time while her mind raced through possible escape routes. "You're going to help us send a message to your patron about the importance of respecting territorial agreements," he said, the clinical phrasing making the threat sound almost professional. Nothing permanent, just persuasive. Zara understood with horrible clarity that she had become exactly what Minjun had warned her about, a pressure point that his enemies could exploit. The comfortable illusion that his protection could keep her separate from his dangerous world had just shattered completely. She stood up slowly, as if preparing to comply, then grabbed her water bottle and threw the contents directly into his face before spinning toward the cafeteria exit. The move bought her perhaps 3 seconds before she heard his chair crash backward and his rapid footsteps pursuing her. The hospital corridors blurred past as she ran toward the main lobby, hoping that witnesses and security cameras might provide protection. Behind her, she could hear him speaking rapidly into what was probably a radio, coordinating with others who were likely positioned throughout the building. She made it to within 20 feet of the main entrance when a second man stepped in her path, his bulk and positioning making it clear that retreat was no longer an option. The casual way he reached inside his jacket suggested he was prepared to use whatever he carried there. "That's far enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Zara looked around desperately, noting the handful of civilians in the lobby who were beginning to realize something unusual was happening. An elderly woman with a walker, 2 young mothers with children, a security guard who looked like he had never faced anything more challenging than directing lost visitors. "Please don't let anyone else get hurt," she said, raising her hands in surrender. "I'll come with you." "Smart choice," the second man replied, moving to take her arm with deceptive gentleness. The massive lobby windows exploded inward at exactly that moment. The sound was beyond description, a combination of shattering glass and roaring engines that seemed to shake the entire building. Through the crystalline cascade of debris came vehicles that had no business being inside a hospital lobby, followed by men in dark suits who moved with military precision and absolute lethality. Minjun emerged from the lead vehicle, like an avenging angel dressed in charcoal and fury. His usual controlled stillness had been replaced by something primitive and devastating, a predator whose territory had been violated and who intended to respond with overwhelming force. The weapon in his hand looked professional and deadly, held with the competence of someone who had used such tools many times before. The men who had been threatening Zara suddenly found themselves surrounded by superior numbers and firepower, their confident coordination dissolving into the desperate calculation of people who had seriously underestimated their opposition. The hospital lobby became a battlefield where the outcome was never really in doubt. "Let her go," Minjun commanded, his voice carrying across the space with absolute authority. Now, instead of complying, the man holding Zara's arm tightened his grip and reached for the weapon inside his jacket. It was the last decision he would ever make. Minjun's response was swift and final, executed with the precision of someone who understood that hesitation in such moments was often fatal. The sound of gunfire in the hospital lobby was shocking and immediate, transforming the sterile medical environment into something that belonged in nightmares rather than healing spaces. When the violence ended, it ended completely. The men who had threatened her were no longer capable of threatening anyone, and Minjun was crossing the debris-strewn lobby with single-minded focus on reaching her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gentle despite the weapon he still held, checking her for injuries with the thoroughness of someone who understood that shock could mask pain. "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice sounded strange and distant in her own ears. "How did you know?" "Security feeds," he replied, holstering his weapon and pulling her against his chest with desperate relief. "I've been monitoring the hospital since the threats began escalating. When they breached the perimeter, I mobilized everything." The embrace was fierce and protective, his arms creating a barrier between her and the carnage that surrounded them. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, rapid despite his outward calm, betraying how close he had come to losing something that had become essential to him. "I can't do this," he said into her hair, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I can't let you be hurt because of what I am. It's not worth the risk." But even as he said it, his arms tightened around her, suggesting that letting her go was not actually a viable option for either of them. Around them, his security team was efficiently managing the aftermath of the confrontation, while hospital staff dealt with evacuating patients and securing the building. The logistics of violence were apparently something his organization handled with the same competence they brought to everything else. "This won't happen again," he continued, his voice regaining its controlled authority. "The people who ordered this, everyone connected to them, anyone who might consider similar action, all of it ends tonight." The promise was delivered with the flat certainty of someone stating facts rather than intentions. Zara realized she was hearing him plan the elimination of an entire rival organization, spoken as casually as someone might discuss weekend plans. And instead of being horrified, she found herself feeling safer than she had since the whole nightmare began. "You could have been killed," she said, pulling back to look at his face. "Coming here like this with all those guns." "The risk was acceptable," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers with absolute focus. "Losing you is not." In that moment, surrounded by shattered glass and the aftermath of violence, Zara understood that what had begun as a protection arrangement had become something much more dangerous and much more real. He hadn't just risked his life to save her. He had revealed the true extent of his power and his willingness to use it absolutely in her defense. The man who had found her through an accidental text message had just declared war on anyone who would dare to hurt her. And despite every rational objection her mind could offer, she realized that his lethal devotion felt exactly like love. As sirens began to wail in the distance, and his team prepared to extract them from the scene, Zara made her own declaration by reaching up to touch his face with hands that were finally steady. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Whatever this costs, whatever it means, I'm staying." The relief that flickered across his features was worth every risk she would ever have to take. 2 weeks after the hospital incident, Seoul's underground had shifted like tectonic plates after an earthquake. The The rival organization that had dared to threaten Zara Williams no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Their leadership had disappeared, their operations had been absorbed or eliminated, and their territories had been redistributed among groups that understood the importance of respecting Min Junkang's boundaries. The efficiency with which he had dismantled an entire criminal enterprise was both impressive and terrifying, proof of the kind of power that could reshape reality through pure will and superior resources. But what struck Zara most was not the scope of his retaliation, but the fact that he had done it all to protect one nursing student whose only crime had been sending a text message to the wrong number. She stood in the living room of what had become their shared space, no longer just his apartment where she was temporarily housed, but a home they had begun to build together through small daily compromises and growing intimacy. Her textbooks shared shelf space with his business files. Her grandmother's photos occupied places of honor next to his family portraits, and the morning routine of shared coffee and quiet conversation had become the foundation of something that felt remarkably like a normal relationship built on extraordinary circumstances. The sound of his key in the electronic lock no longer startled her. He had kept his promise about knocking when she was home alone, but when they were together, the space truly belonged to both of them. "How is she today?" he asked, setting down his briefcase and loosening his tie with the fluid motions of someone shedding the formal armor of business dealings. "Strong," Zara replied, smiling as she turned from the window where she had been watching the city lights emerge in the gathering dusk. "The doctors say her recovery is ahead of schedule. They're calling it remarkable." "Good," he said, crossing the room to stand behind her at the window, his arms circling her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I spoke with Dr. Chan about expanding the cardiac program at Seoul General. Your grandmother's case study will help other patients receive similar care." The casual way he mentioned reshaping hospital policy to honor one elderly woman's recovery was typical of how Minjun operated. Power was not something he displayed for effect, but something he used quietly to improve situations that mattered to people he cared about. "Thank you," she said, leaning back against his solid warmth, "for everything you've done for her. For us." His arms tightened slightly, and she felt him take the careful breath that usually preceded important conversations. "Actually, I want to talk with you about that," he said. "About the original arrangement we made." Zara turned in his arms to face him, noting the unusual tension in his expression. The controlled stillness was still there, but underneath it was something that looked almost like nervousness. "I've been thinking about the contract we established," he continued, his dark eyes holding hers with characteristic intensity. "The protection agreement, the financial arrangements, all of it based on your acceptance of my help during a crisis." She waited, recognizing that he was building towards something significant and not wanting to interrupt the careful construction of whatever he was trying to say. "The crisis is over," he said simply. "The people who threatened you are gone. Your grandmother's medical care is secured indefinitely. Your education is fully funded. You no longer need my protection in any legal or practical sense." The words hit her like cold water, even though his arms were still around her and his tone suggested he was not actually proposing separation. But the reminder that their entire relationship had been built on her desperation and his resources was unwelcome. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice carefully steady. "I'm saying that I want to dissolve the original contract completely," he replied, his voice gaining strength and certainty. "I want you to have the freedom to choose whether to stay or leave based on what you want, not what you need." He released her and stepped back, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made her heart stop beating entirely. "And then I want to ask you to marry me," he continued, dropping to one knee with a fluid grace that marked everything he did. "Not because you need my protection or my money, but because I need your strength and your honesty and your ability to see good in someone like me." The ring inside the box was beautiful in its simplicity, a classic solitaire that spoke of permanence rather than display. But what took her breath away was the expression on his face as he looked up at her. Vulnerability and hope and absolute determination combined in a way that transformed the dangerous man into someone who was simply in love. Zara Williams, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. Will you marry me and help me build something better than either of us could create alone? The question hung between them like a bridge across the space between two very different worlds, offering her the choice to cross freely rather than being carried across by necessity. Yes, she said, the word emerging with absolute certainty despite the complexity of everything it represented. But I have conditions. Name them, he replied immediately, still kneeling with the patience of someone prepared to negotiate whatever terms would secure what he wanted most. I finished nursing school and work in community health, she said. I want to use what we have to help people who don't have resources or connections or protection. Agreed. Your legitimate businesses start partnering with community organizations. I want to see the good that your power can do when it's not focused on territory or competition. Also agreed. And our children, when we have them, grow up understanding that strength means protecting people who can't protect themselves, not just controlling people who are weaker. He smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression she had ever seen from him. Joy and relief, and something that looked like wonder transforming his features into something radiant. Especially agreed, he said, sliding the ring on her finger with hands that were absolutely steady. When he stood and kissed her, it felt like the claiming he had promised during their first conversation, but also like partnership freely chosen and mutually desired. The protection he offered was no longer a cage, but a foundation they would build on together. 3 months later, their wedding was everything that represented both their worlds. Zara's grandmother, fully recovered and radiant in lavender silk, walked her down the aisle of Seoul's most beautiful chapel. Minjun's organization provided security that was invisible but absolute, ensuring that their day belonged entirely to celebration rather than caution. The ceremony itself blended traditions in ways that would have been impossible in either of their separate lives. Korean customs honored his heritage while American elements reflected hers, creating something entirely new that belonged uniquely to them. When the officiant pronounced them married, the applause that erupted from their guests sounded like victory and promise and hope all combined into something that felt like the beginning of everything rather than the end of their individual stories. During the reception, as Zara danced with her new husband while their families mingled with an ease that suggested genuine affection rather than polite tolerance, she realized that the wrong number text that had started everything had been exactly right after all. Have you ever had a moment when everything changed because of one small decision, one unexpected message, one chance encounter that seemed like a mistake but turned out to be exactly what you needed? Share your stories below, because sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unlikely coincidences. Minjun Kong had built an empire on the principle that control was everything and vulnerability was weakness. But as he held his wife during their first dance as a married couple, surrounded by people who had learned to love them both despite their complicated beginning, he understood that some surrenders were actually victories. And Zara Williams Kong, who had once been a broke nursing student sending desperate text messages to wrong numbers, now had everything she had ever wanted and several things she had never dared to dream of. A partner who would protect her with his life, a future secured by both love and resources, and the power to help other people who found themselves in impossible situations with nowhere else to turn. The dangerous man had become her safest place, and the wrong number had led them both exactly where they belonged.